that Elsa sings, and then stop and listen, and you could hear someone respond with that song, just like in the movie. Although you didn't know where the heck that person was. Maybe it was an echo, and she just looked at you like, isn't that weird? Because it's just like the movie. Does anybody know what movie I'm talking about? Elsa? Frozen? Yes? Okay. I'm so out of touch. Okay. So yeah, how do these different senses put things together? You might remember many, 1,300 years? No, 2,000 years ago, before Berkeley, Aristotle thought that there was a common sense. The idea of a common sense was that all these senses with all this input all comes together in some sort of a common sense that puts them all together and says these all go with one another. That was Aristotle. But now we, almost in a scientific way, we're trying to figure out, well, but how does that work? Right? How does that actually work? Objects or ideas of sight have nothing in common with the objects of touch. Connection of sight and touch is arbitrary and learned by experience only. So that's kind of like John Locke and the tabula rasa. All of our knowledge comes from sensory input. Remember, we have a blank slate, and experience writes on our blank slate. So it's learned by experience only. The connection is arbitrary, but it is regular and constant. What we see suggests to us what we may expect to touch and handle. And using sight to guide our movements, we interpret the language of God. That's kind of interesting to me because remember I think I mentioned this book once before, and that is a book by the Dr. Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project, and basically is saying the double helix is the language of God. That's kind of now I think of it, that's an interesting picture because it's made to look like a stained glass window that you would normally see in a church, and yet of course it's the double helix, which is the human genome, the chromosome. Interesting. So the language of God. Okay. One of his books, George Berkeley, aimed primarily at John Locke, and is a criticism of John Locke's philosophy, the materialism. Remember, he's a bishop by this time, and he is trying to prove that Locke's philosophy is false, that things can't be made out of physical things, but instead have to be spiritual things. And his three dialogues are dialogues between Hylas, who is the character who represents, that's Greek for matter, and Philonous, whose Greek word means love of mind, right? So you've got basically John Locke is Hylas and Philonous is Berkeley in this dialogue. And so it's clearly not a dialogue between two real people. This is clearly a made-up dialogue that George Berkeley writes. And so Locke's position is that there are secondary and primary qualities. Secondary qualities do not exist apart from sensations. Primary qualities exist irrespective of our knowledge. In other words, for Locke, you can't know the primary qualities of things, because everything we can know comes through our senses. And as a result, we can't know what causes the reactions our senses have. we're interacting with something, but we can't actually know anything about it apart from the way our senses react to it. That makes common sense, I think, today. But the problem with that is that how does Locke figure out that there are primary qualities in the first place? He's guessing. There's no way you can know those things. And so actually, John Locke's position ends up being a skeptical view of the universe. That we can never know the way the universe actually works because of this limit. That we're stuck only observing our secondary qualities of things, but we're hypothesizing that somehow there's real things out there. Well, since that's a contradiction to think that we can know the things that cause our senses to react the way they do, even though we can't know those things. That's a blatant contradiction. That's just going to lead people to a very skeptical point of view, and Berkeley doesn't like skepticism. He wants us to think God has given us the ability to understand the world, and what we're actually doing is understanding the mind of God. When we're doing science, we're learning what God is thinking. So Berkeley denies this distinction between the primary and the secondary qualities. To be is to be perceived. The only thing that exists are the things that we actually see and hear and taste and touch and stuff. Doesn't make sense. Now, remember, it's not just what you see, or we're all seeing all different things. So the whole world is all being, and it's not just us, the people that are observing it. It's God mostly, right? Even before people were here, right? God was here. To be is to be perceived. Materialists have faith in substance instead of faith in God. And materialists. Much better to believe in God. Of course, the subtext here is that materialists have no grounds for morality. Morality is tied to your theology, and your theology is a story. Remember, our morality comes from our interpretation, our story, right? So we need a narrative that explains why we're here, what's good and bad, etc. Materialists might consider it just nature to assume that impoverished people have no right to continue existing. I'm just guessing. I'm not sure if that's necessarily what a materialist would say. Whereas a theologian or a theist, maybe not a deist even, but a theist, I think, would assume that God wants us to love one another, even those, remember, Jesus said, the way you treat the least among you is how you would treat me, right? So there's a morality associated with that Christian belief. And it's Islamic as well, actually. Okay. So, everything is all in the mind of God. You have, properly speaking, no idea of your own soul. And that's because as a self, you're not actually perceiving yourself. Does that make sense? Yourself is the self that's perceiving. So I think, well, if I look in the mirror, which is not a good thing for me to do these days, because it's, a depressing way to start the day. Yes, I thought, okay, spring is here, it's warm, time to, do away with the Dumbledore contest, So I did the whole thing. Turned out terrible. My wife hasn't helped yet, so I've got it's butchered, you know. That's one of the main reasons I'm wearing my Disney hat today. What happened to Disney? There he is. Mickey. In any case, yeah, I trimmed it all off, and that night the temperature dropped to 22 degrees and it snowed. This is just, and by the way, everyone's aware that they think Mount Spur is about to blow. Actually, they say 50-50. In my book, 50-50 is like, well, it's just only 50-50. You know, I'm not going to, it might blow. Nope. You know, but you know, even the university has emailed us probably. Get yourself ready. Make sure you have an N95 mask ready. That's another explanation of why you got to get rid of the beard, because you know you put a mask on top of a beard and it just kind of floats around. There's no actually. But you get the idea. I did go out and buy extra food for the dogs, because you know if you run out of food for the dogs and you can't go outside because of the ash, the dogs will eat you. You know that's how that works. You know. There's so many stories about pet dogs deciding, well, let's eat these people if they're not going to feed us. Kind of, sort of. Oh, well. So you have no idea of your own soul. When you're looking at the mirror, you're not actually seeing yourself in the mirror. You're seeing your reflection. In fact, did you ever notice that the right side is always on the other side? My question, and this isn't a quiz question, but why isn't the top at the bottom? I mean, if I look and my face is reversed in the mirror, right? How come it's reversed this way and not this way?
That's how our eyes work.
That's exactly right. If I tilt like this, it does the same thing that way. So it's our eyes disposition that causes that. But the thing is, it's important to realize that even when I'm thinking of myself, what I'm thinking about is my sense impression of what I think I am. In other words, just like Doug Hofstadter talking about the idea of us being a tunnel, or we're just an infinite loop, basically, that I'm seeing myself thinking that's me, but it's really not, because it's me as I'm imagining myself, etc., etc. Barclay's already, yes, go ahead.
I just had a question.
Chelsea.
I've seen this thing where if you we weren't meant to see ourselves all the time with mirrors. We're the most we'd see ourselves before mirrors were invented was in a reflection of a lake or something like that, and it's not good to see yourself all the time. I don't know.
That's the story of Narcissus, right?
Okay.
Narcissus drowned himself in the lake because he couldn't stop looking at himself, and he eventually drowned himself, that's pretty dumb, you know. Narcissus, Greek story, I love the looking through a glass darkly. You've heard that expression. Plato says, for now we're looking through a glass darkly, but once we're dead, we'll see ourselves as we really are, and heaven, right? And of course, St. Paul actually copies that and puts it in one of his letters. For now, we're seeing ourselves. We see through a glass darkly. That's kind of neat. What do they mean by that? Well, they had really lousy mirrors back then, so your image wasn't very good.
Yeah.
Pretty neat. I like the accumulation of these things, these little tidbits that we like. So we'll get into that issue more when we talk about the next philosopher, David Hume. So I can't really see myself. I have no idea of my own soul. Notion of matter as the unthinking support of ideas is repugnant or self-contradictory. So he's really upset with John Locke. Don't believe in materialism. And it's no repugnancy to say that a perceiving thing should be the subject of ideas, or an active thing the cause of them. While I have no reason for disbelieving the existence of matter, the being of myself, that is my own soul, mind, or thinking principle, I evidently know by reflection, not just in the symbolic sense of a mirror, but in the sense of me thinking about myself. And we're definitely into individuals that are self-reflective at this point. Remember, it might have been Descartes that first invented the idea of self-reflection. It might have been William Shakespeare and Hamlet. Lots of different arguments over who first started thinking about individuals thinking about themselves. I still wonder about Augustine because he talks that way, although he is always talking to God. So he's not really just talking to himself. He's talking to God and asking God questions. But we're clearly into what we think of today as the modern self. When we're talking about Berkeley and others and talking about what the self is. Spirit is the only real cause of power. Now remember, I would argue that he's using that word and meaning what we today would say is energy. Not everybody accepts that, by the way. Especially British folks. I don't know why. Such is the nature of spirit, or that which acts, that it cannot